All right. Well, I know you just got finished listening to a past episode of Owning the Goal, and we're back here with Owning the Goal. This is a podcast that helps you take charge of your sales and life success. I'm its creator and host, Brian McFarland, and I'll share my stories and insights and inspiration from my 40 plus years selling career as an individual seller and sales teacher. But like you, I'm much more than just a salesperson, which is why this isn't a podcast just about sales. We talk about other passions like books, sports, music, mental fitness, physical fitness, and relationships and how they relate to us hitting our goals, because success in sales is success in life. And you, the listeners, I'm going to tell you that I am so honored. I'm having a fan guy moment here to have the incredible Debbie Caudle at debbiecaudle.com on the show this morning. And I'm just going to give a little preamble and then throw the mic to Debbie. Debbie is a relationship expert over the last 30 years. She helps individuals and couples reconnect. She's a master change maker in healing, self-worth, communication. She has an amazing podcast I'd tell you to listen to right after this, the High Ticket Woman podcast. But lots of men should be listening to that as well, as I did. And as I just told her a minute ago, she saved me $43,800, but she's going to tell you what that's about. And so many amazing things. So I'm going to introduce her and let her tell you her story. But the first thing I'm going to ask you to tell you that I was listening when I first woke up this morning is, are you drinking the coffee tea accidental mixture?
I am not, but I did. First of all, hi, everybody. It's great to be here. What Brian's referring to is I did a social media post the other day about how I was running late. And so rather than making my non-coffee alternative, because I got diagnosed with acid reflux about 4 years ago. So they told me I have to get off caffeine. But every once in a while, I let myself have coffee. So I was running late, and my husband always has like half empty cups of coffee everywhere. So there were two of them laying around. Actually, one was in the fridge. So I combined them, put them in the microwave, heated it up, only to discover that one of them was tea. So I had now this weird mix of tea and coffee that I drank. And I thought, there's value into turning this into a post. So no, but I did grab one of his unfinished cups of coffee this morning for the same reason. I was like, I am pressed for time. I'm grabbing Jeff's unfinished coffee. He'll just have to make himself more when he gets home.
So that would be not an example, because I just listened to the post about how a man shows you he loves you by mowing the lawn before he's asked and whatnot. So that would fall in the category of perhaps not leaving his coffee cups around. But we'll get to that later.
Yeah. So, I want to say, I want to make a comment about your background in sales, because I think this is so hugely important, and it's a good blend of what you do, Brian, and what I do. And that is, I believe everybody's in sales. I believe everybody is a walking billboard, for whether you know it or not. So people look at you and they assess based on the way you dress, the way you carry yourself, the things that come out of your mouth. They assess your value system. They assess your perspective in life. They make judgments about you based on how you carry yourself. So you are selling something, whether that's what people want to buy or not. You are selling something. And I think that is a really critical thing for people to understand, because I know people who think that sales is this, incredibly difficult thing to do, and people label themselves as saying, I'm not a good salesperson, or salespeople are sleazy, or we have all these labels that we use for people, but everybody is selling something.
Thank you so much for saying that, and that's why I created the podcast to say that. So you just said it so well. So question for you on that thread. So thank you for saying that.
Sure.
would you say, as the relationship guru you are, and I just said to Debbie as we got on the call just a second ago, I said you've already helped me in my relationship management, in my doing my homework, and just really looking into what you do, going through your website. I know I'm going to be a better partner already. So thank you for that. Would you say, is it safe to say, thank you. Would it be safe to say on the sales topic, and then I really do want you to tell your story because it's amazing. Would you say you're selling, since we're talking about it in an authentic way, are you selling in your relationship?
All the time. Because as you well know, as a salesperson, your attitude is a big part of what you're selling, the energy behind what you say and do. So for example, if I want to show up differently in my marriage with Jeff, and I'm trying to be more positive, but I'm not putting a lot of energy behind the positive things I'm saying. If I thank him for all the things he does, but my energy is kind of like, oh, thanks. Then am I really selling that? Is he really buying that? Or internally is he going, she's saying the words, but she doesn't really mean that. So yes, our energy, I always say, put the exclamation points behind the things that you really want to reinforce in your marriage, because the exclamation points can convey energy, and that's what sells.
I love that. And in fact, the other day I actually said to my partner, two clients I'm trying to do business with, one ends, not every sentence, but the sentences he's trying to emphasize with an exclamation point. And it's so powerful to me. Mm-hmm. And I commented on that to him, and he said, thank you for noticing, because I really do mean that. So that's one of my takeaways. And by the way, listeners, stay with us till the end. You always do that great hook with your show of why people should stay till the end, because this episode is going to be filled with so many tips, entertaining thoughts and advice that you can hire Debbie for, but you're going to get it for free today. So thank you for that. So Debbie, I have to have you tell the listeners your incredible story from Canada to horses to the Middle East to Texas to Mexico, because it's amazing.
Well, I'll try to do the condensed version of that. Otherwise, we'll be here a long time. But yeah, I'm Canadian. I come from a long line of teachers. And that was what I set out to do when I went to college. And I think I disappointed my parents when I stepped into the counseling world and did that instead. But I have found my way back to teaching, because so much of what I do, I really say I'm a relationship coach as much as a therapist, because I do so much teaching and education in the way that I approach my work. And I think that's really, really key, because most people, if they're going to invest this kind of time and money and energy into working with me, they're looking for results. They're not looking to just vent about a problem and have me, nod and make sympathetic noises. They're looking for tools. They're looking for, help me know what I'm doing wrong and help me how to fix this. But it took me, it was this circuitous journey to get to where I am now. So for many years, I worked in the counseling world, the traditional counseling world, and when you start off as a therapist, you see everybody, it's very generic. You see people of all ages and all problems. And that lays a really solid foundation, that gives you a lot of, experience. But I learned over the years that what I was really, really passionate about is what I'm doing now. I love working with couples. I love focusing on relationships. And I honestly think that I got into counseling because I love happy endings. I am a romantic at heart, and I love watching people's relationships transform when they get it, when they see that something that they're doing, their spouse is now responding to, and it lights them up from the inside out, and they begin to have their own sort of success story. That is what thrills me, and that's what keeps me doing this after 30 years. The story that you're referring to, that comes with my first marriage, and that's a bittersweet story because, of course, I'm now divorced. I met my first husband when I was 26, and I had attended a private Christian college where it seemed like everybody there, on the day after graduation was getting married, everyone but me. So at 22, I went right from there into grad school. And, I just was knuckled down going to school and focusing on that. And by the time I was 25, I was getting ready to graduate. And I remember praying to God, I'm 25 years old, barely, just turned 25. God, I really think I'm ready to get married. I'm about to finish grad school. I'm in this phase in my life. So if it's your will, I really want to be married by the end of next year. And this was December of 93. Well, I met my future husband a week later. And, that relationship began to take off, and we were married by December 28th of the following year. So my whole marriage, through the ups and downs, I really truly believed that was God answering my prayer. So with every challenge that my marriage was facing, I just kept saying, this is hang in there, Debbie. This is what God wanted for you. If this isn't easy, maybe it's not supposed to be easy. But there were very clear differences between my husband at the time and me. We had very different education. I just finished my master's. He had a high school degree. He always told me he didn't care. That didn't matter to him. So I decided it didn't matter to me. But there were some significant challenges with that. He was never into self-improvement. He didn't read. He had some learning challenges in terms of holding on to, memory. He really relied on me to make a lot of decisions. And I don't know that he wasn't capable of those things, but I came to believe he wasn't capable. And I think some of the reason I came to believe that was because he kept telling me that he just couldn't remember things, that he just wasn't good at certain things. And when you say that enough to yourself, and then on the receiving end, you hear that enough, you begin to sort of absorb that and go, okay, I guess it's up to me to make all these decisions. And that put a lot of weight and responsibility on me to be the decision maker in the relationship. And we launched, he was a contractor, but he was also, I would say, a wannabe cowboy. He really liked that lifestyle. He had grown up with a horse. He wanted to own horses. So about the middle of our marriage, because we were married almost 24 years, about the middle of our marriage, I went and got trained because of him pushing me in this equine assisted psychotherapy, which really enabled us to begin to use horses in the counseling field. And we bought land. We got 44 acres just outside of town in Wyoming. We built a big arena. We lived upstairs. Our offices were downstairs, and we became a very premier counseling center because we were the only ones in our county that offered this unique type of therapy. But it required my husband to give up contracting. He had to be the equine specialist and, partnered with me in session. And that really put a lot of stress on our marriage because that made me the really essentially main provider. If he was sick in any given day, I would move clients into the office. Business as usual. If I was sick, everything shut down because he wasn't a therapist. He wasn't doing therapy. And even though, it required, both of us to be present in these equine sessions, it was never lost on me that there was this big giant weight on my shoulders. And the more we grew, the more pressure that was for me because he really wasn't interested in the running of the business. He didn't know how to use computers and he refused, quite honestly, to learn. So I was in charge of the clinical responsibilities and I was in charge of the back end. And, as we grew, we hired other therapists. So I had to supervise them. It just was a lot of pressure. And as we grew, we began to, bill Medicaid and, of course, insurance, and that requires a lot of back end work too. And I just found myself getting really, really burnt out. And it came to a head in 2013. I had essentially began to step away from the business. I didn't know how. I'd asked my husband in so many different ways, to please, help me out. And he wasn't willing to do things to take things off of my plate. So I look at it now, and though I wouldn't have recognized it as this at the time, I really sort of began to sabotage the business. I was doing things to sort of undermine the business because I didn't know how to walk away from it any other way. So I stopped taking Medicaid. So boom, we lost a bunch of clients that way. Then I stopped taking insurance, and I had all these reasons and justifications for it. But it really, then we had to let go of staff. And it really began to, financially affect us. It forced him over time to go back into contracting. And I started having panic attacks for the first time in my life. I had worked with people who had panic attacks, but now I was experiencing them. And so I had been going to therapy off and on, but now I got back into therapy myself, really very intentionally. And I started really listening to myself and going, what's going on? Because, my therapist going, Debbie, you have this black cloud over you. Like, there's no hope in your life. And yet you've got all these positive things going on, but you seem unable to see them. And I realized that all the things I'd been saying to clients over the years, I wasn't embracing myself. And I began to go, this has to change. I've got to take responsibility for this. So I began to implement intentional steps in my life to get out from underneath the emotional weight that I was feeling. And the more I did that, the happier I got, the more peaceful I began to feel. But I put some things in motion that impacted my marriage and my husband. For example, we just could not sustain the cost of the ranch. But I didn't want to give up the ranch. So I suggested we buy, our old house had come back on the market at less than we had sold it for. So it was a good deal. And I suggested that we buy that back as an investment. We rent out the ranch, and it's only a 10-minute drive. We can go feed the horses. Someday we can move back to the ranch. So my husband agreed, because remember, I'm the decision maker. He's very passive. He just goes along with what I'm saying. So we did that. And moving into that house was this huge game changer for me, because it gave me hope. It lowered our mortgage. I began to see, like, okay, we can get out from underneath this incredible financial strain. I also really, because he'd gone back to contracting, it freed me up to not work as hard. I really had scaled back to the point where had gone from 40 plus clients a week, to like 1 or 2. I was barely bringing in any money. That helped me a lot too, because that allowed me to just really, really work on myself. That was about 1.5 years of just, really just very minimal therapy. And I was so burnt out. It was like walking through thick mud. I was so mentally fatigued that I didn't even, the thought of doing anything with the business was just mentally exhausting. But I began to make other decisions for us that I knew would free us up and help us out financially. And ultimately, one of those decisions was that we would leave Wyoming and we would go back to Texas. And this was I look back now and I could see this was a very difficult thing for my husband, because this meant ultimately selling the ranch and selling the horses. And, I had this belief that we could, recreate that lifestyle in Texas, but moving to Texas would move us closer to family and church and just, again, things that I felt would be really good for us as a couple. But we weren't communicating about them. I was talking about the benefits out loud. He was agreeing outwardly, but inwardly, I think he felt very differently, and he just wasn't stepping up and telling me how he felt. Well, so we moved to Texas. We took some theology courses for 10 months. Again, I'm not working. He's not working. We're living off his savings. And then from there, we went to the Middle East. This was a church sponsored, situation where he and I were both at different schools working. He was in a special needs school and I was at a baccalaureate school. And it was this amazingly wonderful experience. Culturally, I love to travel. That's definitely in my blood. And my husband had traveled with me, but it wasn't like something that he just loved to do. But again, he agreed to go do this. And that was really the beginning of the end of our marriage. We separated in Jordan. And you can imagine, when I say separated, I just mean like separate bedrooms, because we were still living under the same roof. And that was unbelievably challenging, because Jordan, like much of Asia, doesn't embrace, they're very behind the Western countries in terms of mental health. So there wasn't like there was any therapist that we could go to and get help. I really didn't want anybody to know, how embarrassing is it, that a therapist who's worked with couples for, decades can't fix their own marriage, right? So, I had this great plan that at the end of this school year, my husband, because I had been offered a job, the school I was working at, they wanted me to come back for a second year. And my husband had agreed up until the point that the marriage sort of disintegrated and we were separated. And then he said, I'm not coming back. So I had this fantastic plan. You go back, you live with your parents because they got some health challenges. That'll be the reason everybody knows that you're back. I'll stay in Jordan. I'll come back, 2-3 times throughout the year to visit. I'll go home over the summer. We'll get a marriage therapist. You'll work with them locally. I'll work with them virtually. We'll fix this. We'll be fine. Well, of course, that's not what happened. And of course, we were not able to keep it secret. He was sent home prematurely. His mental health really decompensated. And he had to be sent home in a state of crisis. Very, very difficult, very scary time for everybody that was there, because we were there with 3 other young adult females. I was sent home 3 weeks later. Neither of us made it quite to the end of the school year. And I came home, 2-3 weeks after him, and he had already begun the process of absolutely just, slandering me to anybody who would listen. So I walked back into a really difficult situation where, some people wouldn't talk to me anymore. They just believed whatever he was telling them. And I was hearing different things, so I'm not even sure that he was being consistent about what he was telling people. But that whole summer of 2018, because this was, it really took 5 years from that difficult year that I mentioned, 2013. It took 5 more years for things to fall apart. But that year, what held me together was that I had to start my business all over again. I mean, I really was resurrecting something that I had been systematically undoing since 2013. So now 5 years later, I have no business, I have me, and starting over again in 2018 is a whole nother thing. Back in the day in 2004, when I was getting started, transitioning from, working in the educational system, community colleges, into private practice, I could just take an ad out in the yellow pages, business cards. And I lived in a small town of 10,000 people. So I could put flyers up, at different locations, and that generated business. But now I was stepping into the world of social media, and I didn't know what I was doing. And it was terrifying, but exciting at the same time.
Debbie, let me just
I know
interrupt
there's
you a
a
second.
lot,
No,
so yeah.
no, it's so amazing. So thank you, and you did that so well. But there's some obvious questions that I need to ask. So 24 years is nothing to sneeze at, right?
No.
Like that sounds. So I guess my first question is. This is the doctor who shouldn't be operating on themselves, correct?
All right.
Because here you are, this professional therapist. So I guess talk to me and the listeners, because if I'm a listener, I'm listening right now and going, wait a minute, this woman, kudos to you for sticking it out for 24 years.
Yeah.
But on the same side, if you were able to step out of it,
Mm-hmm.
and you were to be your therapist, your couple's
Mm-hmm.
therapist, and it's probably part of, I would assume, what helps you be so good at what you do, right? Are there times that you can mark and go, I probably should have gotten out at that point for both of your benefits? because 24 years is a long time to go
Yeah.
through that much stress. So I'm just
Yeah.
curious as to your mindset. Like, kudos
Yeah.
to you for sticking with it for 24 years, but how would you have advised yourself if you had yourself as a therapist?
Yeah.
Fair
That's such
question?
it's a complicated question for me because I was his second wife, and there was a part of me that felt sort of challenged to, they'd been married 6.5 years. So part of me felt challenged to definitely make it, longer. And I came into this marriage feeling like he had been mistreated by her, by our church, so I was really his champion. But the other really big factor in this was that I don't believe in divorce. I wasn't raised to believe in divorce. My church, and now that I've experienced divorce, I know what it's like to be in a church where, it's so stigmatized. So I had a lot of reasons to try to stick it out and try to fight and make it work. But the other thing that was really against me in viewing it through that lens that you're talking about is that my husband at the time had really done a really good job of systematically making me believe that it was me. And I didn't see that as any sort of emotional abuse, ironically, because again, when you're a therapist, you're working with people whose situation seems so much worse than yours. I was always looking at my marriage through the lens of other people who were coming to see me, and grateful that my marriage wasn't that bad. But on any given day, he was always sort of undermining me, in things that I would do. And it was very, very subtle things. He needed a lot of attention from me. So if I had a television on while I was cooking dinner, why does the TV have to be on? If I was reading a book, why don't you put your book down and talk to me? There was just so many little things that the implied message was, you're doing something wrong. And he would say things like TV watching person, reading person, there was like little labels attached to the things that I would do. And so when I went to therapy, which I did on and off for 8 years, I was never working on my marriage. I was working on me because I had really embraced this idea that it was my fault. And the other really important thing about this is that I needed the world to believe that my husband, that we didn't have role reversal going on in this marriage, that my husband was the God-given leader, and yet I knew he wasn't. And I felt embarrassed by that. I knew that I was the one in charge, but I needed to hide that, right? Because I knew that I would be judged for that, that I would be considered bossy or controlling or, demanding. And so I was constantly trying to keep up this facade of, propping him up to be a leader when he wasn't, for many, very many, many reasons. And, I think he wanted to be. I think there were times when he would be, I think this was what really brought our marriage to the end, was this growing resentment in him that I was making decisions. And yet so much of the culture of our marriage, it had forced me into that situation. So yeah, now as a therapist and now remarried to, an incredibly different man, an amazing man, I can look back on that marriage now and I can see it through a different lens. I can see what love really is, right? I look back and I think, even though my first husband said, I love you, a lot, that really wasn't love compared to what I'm experiencing now. But it was very difficult to see that in the day in and the day out. So what I do now to help people, see their marriage through a different lens is to really sort of identify what are you unhappy about? Let's start there. What don't you have that you want? But then to begin to quickly shift the lens to what are you accepting and why are you accepting that? This may be a boundary issue. You're blaming your spouse. You're angry. You're resentful. I can definitely relate to that. But what are you saying yes to that you need to say no to? And why are you doing that? There's lots of other things that are going on there, but boundaries play a really big part in this. The inability to say, hey, this isn't okay. Why is this happening?
Yeah. And thank you so much for that. And so helpful. There's two. Since I've been listening to the episodes. First off, you don't look anywhere near old enough to have been married for 24 years and then married again. So good for you. And I was thinking of the Clash song, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Should I stay or should I go now? And the next line is, if I stay, there will be trouble. If I go, there will be double.
Yeah.
So that
True.
kind of maybe, and I had written this earlier, but then I was trying to find the place to put it in. And that maybe explains a little bit in a very simplistic way, especially with your faith and whatnot, and how, if you get divorced, it looks so terrible. I listened to episode 76 this morning about boundaries. And that is one thing that I'm going to talk with my partner about, because I wrote down the key points: is making love sustainable, bringing peace to your marriage, not having, I put a zero with a line through it, a brick wall that's of pain and fear. But what I loved was absolutely the gates and guardrails and the speed bumps portion. So I thought that was so relatable to me, and I know it would be relatable to listeners, because I think that's kind of a great blueprint for relationship management, if you will. So can you expand upon that a little bit?
Sure. So I like to use metaphors. I call myself the metaphor queen. And, I mix my metaphors up a lot too. And I make no apologies for that, because whatever helps people understand is what I'm going to do. But I use these metaphors to explain boundaries, because I think people get really confused about what boundaries are. Boundaries are not about telling people what to do, right? Boundaries are expectations that you have for how you need to be treated. And we always want to give people the freedom to be who they are. But if who they are is goes against our value system, then this is not okay. So boundaries help to navigate that. But brick wall boundaries are very inflexible. They're very rigid, and they come from this place of fear from past experiences. I don't want to get hurt. I don't trust that you're going to keep me safe. So I now have this very inflexible standard, rigid, no matter what the situation, it's still no. As opposed to the speed bump boundaries where, I care more about you than I care about me. So, my people pleasing tendencies make it very difficult for me to mean what I say. So I might say, look, I really prefer that you don't do that. Oh, wait, you're going to do it anyway. Okay. There you go. You just drove right over me. Those are speed bumps, right? They deter people, but not much. And I see this all the time, because not only do you have to verbalize your boundary, but you have to then enforce your boundary. There's 2 steps to boundaries. So you can say, this is how I want to be treated. But then if you continually compromise with that, then do you really have a boundary about that? I guess not. And that's what you're teaching everybody around you. The gates and the guardrails, though, those are what I call the healthy boundaries, because gates, and I had a client the other day refer to them as doors. And I love that metaphor too, because it applies, it's the same concept. Gates, doors, guardrails, whatever, gates open and close, and we open a gate and we leave it open as long as the person is treating us the way that we need to be treated. If they demonstrate daily through their words and actions, they're aligned, that they love us, they care about us, that they value us, the gate stays open. But if they do something that hurts us, disappoints us, betrays us, then we close the gate. But the closing of the gate doesn't have to be a permanent thing. We explain to that person, look, you've hurt me. It's going to take me a little while to get back on my emotional footing, to trust you again, to believe that this isn't going to happen a second time. So as a result, I'm going to, and then that's the definition of the gate. Here come the boundaries. I'm going to interact with you differently. I'm going to, feel differently towards you. I'm going to limit my time with you, whatever needs to happen in that specific situation. And then as I begin to regain that trust, the gate begins to open again.
That's beautiful. And listeners, you should be sending Debbie money right now.
If only it worked that way.
I know. But I encourage you, go to episode 76, because you really do a great job, and in a very concise way.
Thank you.
Which I loved so much. One question I have for you, well, many questions, but this is one. So I love how you put it, when I was looking at your website, first off, some great testimonials by people who you've changed their life and you've changed their relationships, because when we do enter a relationship, partnership, marriage, whatever it's going to be, we all want it to work, right? Of course, and it is work. Right. You pointed out something where you said, how do you keep it right when we all enter that relationship first? It's all roses and everything, and then eventually it's not that, right? So that's going to be my first question is, how do you sustain that? And then my second question is, when a couple comes to you, or an individual comes to you for couples therapy, or how do you, and is there a time when you look and you go, I remember there was an old column by, I think it was Heloise in Good Housekeeping, is can this marriage be saved? And so how two great helps to the listener is, how can you sustain, the flowery, rosy part, and then also with you as a therapist, when you're looking at a couple who's coming to you, when do you realize it's time to tell them that this isn't necessarily going to work?
Well, I'm going to answer the second one first. I never tell couples that, with one exception. If somebody is really being abused, physically, sexually, emotionally, if there's significant abuse in a relationship, then I might say that. And I tell people, you can separate while still working on the relationship. There are two kinds of separation. The kind that's the precursor to divorce, where, I might be pretending to work on the relationship, but really I just want out. And there's it's very obvious to tell the difference between these two types of separation, because, the person, when they leave, right, they stop working on the relationship. The distance gets further and further emotionally between the couple. But there's another kind of separation where we have to stop the cycle of what's happening between us. And the only way to do that is for us to step apart, but we are getting professional help. We are using the tools that we've been given to work on this relationship with the intent of being able to come back together. So that might be something that I recommend to people, but I never say it's time for you to walk away from your marriage, because I feel a responsibility before God to not do that. And it's not my job to tell people essentially what to do. It's my job to help people understand the consequences of the decisions that lie before them. But to your first question, how do you sustain it? You gave me a great metaphor when you said roses, how do you keep everything all rosy? I use this garden metaphor a lot when it comes to marriage, because, at the beginning of a relationship, we love the way that makes us feel, right? And so like the planting of a garden, there's a lot of excitement and energy in picking a place for your garden and preparing the ground and buying the plants and arranging them and watching them bloom, right? That part's fun. The building of a relationship is fun. But, then comes the weeding. And, in the early stages of a relationship, the weeds are really small. And so they're easy to as you walk through the garden, they're easy to pick and pull out. But the day-to-day routine of life and the mundane, and the stressors of life, they begin to sort of take over. And the passion and excitement and the, natural hormones that are flowing through the body when you fall in love, that transitions into, something, a different kind of a relationship. I think a much stronger, healthier type of relationship. But if you're not daily walking metaphorically through that garden and looking for those weeds, weeds have a thing about them. They grow fast. And before you know it, they've taken over. And for a while you can look at that garden and go, it still looks really beautiful. Okay, yeah, there's some weeds in it, but the flowers are still blooming and there's all this color and I can still really enjoy the garden. And then you blink twice and you look and go, what happened? I don't even see the flowers anymore. I don't see the garden anymore. It's just all weeds. And this is where we begin to metaphorically go, there's nothing left. There's nothing left to enjoy. And it's not true. It's just that people have waited way too long to do anything about this. And they've lost sight of what they once had and could get back to if they were just willing to go pull some weeds. Except now the weeds are far more deeply entrenched. The roots of those weeds have really taken hold, and it's going to take some serious tools, some serious digging to pull those weeds out. And unfortunately, not everybody has the time or energy in their brain to want to do that. But somehow they think that going and finding a new plot of land and starting all over is easier than just really putting some serious effort into the garden that they have.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I love this so much because sharing back with you, I'm divorced, so I had a marriage that lasted for 13 years. We produced 2 good children, so as much as I may be at end sometimes with my former spouse, there's 2 human beings on the planet because we were together.
Yes.
We got together, right? So for whatever reason, that's wonderful for a lot of reasons. The garden, I love the symbolism of the garden because it's so symbolic of so many things, right? Mm-hmm. People with addiction, if they let that go unchecked, we constantly talk about how you let the weeds grow and then you don't really have the clear path, so it's harder to progress down that path because the doing the like you call it weeding can be mundane, but I guess so. Great question back to you is finding it. So if we look at the weeding as mundane, we're not going to do it, and then it's going to be harder to do, and then eventually it's going to be what we seem as too hard. So how do we make the weeding? How do we make it fun so that we both want to do it together?
Well, this could probably be a whole nother episode here. We're really talking about mindset, aren't we? We're talking about, the way you perceive weeding. If you see weeding as a chore, then you're going to do everything you can to avoid it. I mean, chore being a bad thing. If you see weeding actually in a positive way as like, hey, my spouse and I, my partner and I, we really need to find ways to daily connect. We need to put in the time and the effort to not just, passing on the way to the fridge or the coffee pot or, out the door. Hey, how's it going? How was your day? That's what so many marriages end up with is just this, talking about the day-to-day tasks and, the mundane. The daily weeding doesn't have to be a chore. It can be fun. Like, hey, let's set aside our phones. Let's turn the TV off. Let's go for a walk. Jeff and I, when we were first married, we lived in Florida and we had a community pool in our HOA and we had a pool bag. And at the end of every day, whether either of us individually felt like it or not, we always went to the pool. I mean, like literally the moment my last session was over, one or the other of us has said, are we going to the pool? Yep, we're going to the pool. We change into our bathing suits, grab our pool bag, drive the 2 minutes to the pool because, sometimes it's just too hot to walk and we're lazy. And what was great about that for us, the pool is my husband's a total water baby. So he that's going to be his choice for the daily weeding. But I left we would leave our phones at home, right? So we've already stepped away from something that is such a huge distraction. And now we're in the pool. Well, guess what we're doing? We're talking. and we're talking about things that we wouldn't be talking about at home. We're talking, my husband loves to talk about politics and the global affairs. And that's not something I'm like, but I give him that time because that is important to him. I love to talk about relationships. So, we sometimes we talk about us, my favorite topic. How can we make us even better? So he gives space for me to talk about that. I give him space to talk about things he loves to talk about. But because we did that very consistently, it never felt like work. It was fun. Now we don't have the pool accessible to us. And when we lived in Mexico, it was way too hot to do that on any given day, even though we did have a pool. So the pool became sort of a different thing for us. But we would go for walks in the evening when the sun went down and it wasn't so hot anymore. We would go for walks, shorter walks, because you're getting sticky, right? But now that we're back in Texas, we still go for walks, and we found this really great walking trail. We drive to the walking trail and we'll walk for 45 minutes or an hour. Imagine the weeding, air quotes, the weeding that gets to happen in that space of time, because we get to unpack things that maybe we don't typically talk about. We're holding hands the whole time. It feels very nurturing. It doesn't feel like a chore.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I feel like I'm embracing, first off, I've always said, some of the best conversations I've ever had with people have been in a pool.
Yes.
I don't know why. But some of my life partner and I, we live in New York City, so there's no pools accessible to us. But we do take that daily walk. There's two things we do. We take that daily walk at the end of the day. And I don't know if you feel this, but we both have found and said to each other, when we're walking and not making eye contact, and here I am as a salesperson saying this, I would say the quality of those conversations is at an all-time high, where we feel like we can say anything. So why do you think, you're taking a walk, so you're kind of doing the same thing. You're so well studied in all this. Why do you think, and really this is a legitimate personal question for me, why do you think I'm guessing when you're walking with Jeff, right, you're not making eye contact at that moment. Why do you think it makes it so different and makes it so powerful?
That's a really interesting question. And I don't know. I do know what you're talking about. Maybe it's just you feel relaxed. Maybe when you're walking side by side, it feels very companionable. Like I said, we hold hands. I don't know if you and your partner do, but like that seems like you're nodding. Yeah. So yeah, that feels like a very natural thing to do when you are out with your partner. So I think you're in a relaxed state, and that is a precursor to feeling emotionally safe and opening up. I always say if you want to fight in a healthy way, sit next to each other and touch. But if you ever noticed when you're mad at each other, you don't do that. You ever notice when you're mad at each other, you put distance between, you're on opposite sides of the room, and the further apart you are, the easier it is to yell at each other. Well, if you want to change that, get closer, sit next to each other, put your hand on each other's knee or hold hands. It calms you right down. So I think there's probably something to that, and remember, things like walking and holding hands it's releasing oxytocin, which is the love hormone. That warm, cuddly feeling that you get when you spend time with your spouse, whether you're sitting on the couch and holding hands or in the car and holding hands. Jeff and I do that a lot. One of the things I love that Jeff does is sometimes he'll just grab my hand and bring it up and kiss it, bring my hand up to his mouth while we're driving. And I just think, that's just, I'm sure there's like this big rush of oxytocin going on inside of me every time he does that, because it's just this cool thing. It feels like this old fashioned chivalrous thing for a guy to do. And I personally love it. But I think that's probably part of what's happening, is that you feel relaxed. There's this nice release of oxytocin, and you just feel safe to be able to open up and really talk to each other.
I love that. And I will say, I'm glad I'm following your prescription, because I always have to be touching my partner.
Yes.
If we're sitting having a meal, I'm putting my foot on her foot.
Yeah.
I literally cannot not touch her.
Not touch her, yeah.
And it's not in a, it's just in a loving way. It's just like,
Yeah, it's not, it doesn't, so much of touch needs to be non-sexual because you need to be able to convey to your partner that affection isn't just about wanting to have sex, right? Especially, I think, for men to be loving and affectionate and touching their partner in ways that isn't all about sex. Because I mean, we're getting a little off track here when I say this, but there are many, many women who resent the fact that the only time their partner wants to touch them is, like, I'm touching you and you're responding, hey, can we go have sex, right? And now that gets linked with something very different for a woman.
I agree, 100%. And I'm going to throw a tip out to any gentleman who's listening. I throw this out to all young men in relationships. I taught myself long ago that in the city for flowers, right? So talk about like the daily weeding. Mm-hmm. It's kind of the opposite. I can get tulips for $6, so I don't have to spend a lot of money. I bring my life partner, and it's not me patting myself on the back, but I bring her flowers at least once a week. And I make the running joke because I watch so many guys who only when they're in trouble, they show up with the $50 2 dozen roses with baby's breath, and I watched that one guy buy it one time, and I was like 30, and I said, What are you doing? He's like, oh, you wouldn't believe what I did yesterday and whatever. And I'm like, so you think 24 flowers for $50 is going to fix it? He's like, well, it better. And I said, I'm no relationship manager, but I said, actually, you're telegraphing the fact that you did something really wrong. Yes. And it's nice that you're apologizing, but how about this? Why don't you just give her flowers all the time? I make huge mistakes all the time. So, but the consistent flow of flowers, I think, is my attempt at daily weeding, because we're all going to make mistakes in our relationships. Yeah. So I think it's just that constant flow. So
and what you're really saying, which is so true, is that now those flowers come to represent something very different, right? If Jeff only gave me flowers when he feels like he's in the doghouse, those flowers can communicate to me, something very different than if there was this regular, I bought you flowers just because I love you. Instead, I bought you flowers because I have to. I bought you flowers because I screwed up and I want to say I'm sorry. So will this make it better? And that's the only time I ever give you something nice. It changes the meaning of the gift.
Yeah, for sure. Debbie, I know I could talk. I could talk to you for 100 hours, and I'm hopeful that we can have this be an ongoing thing, because you're really, both of our missions, I think, in life is, if we do the podcast, we joked earlier and said, I assume one person's listening, maybe, if I'm lucky. So if I think a successful episode is when at least one person gets some form of help in one capacity. But what I would love for you to share with the listeners is the $43,800 mistake, and how people can not make that.
Okay. Yes. I discovered recently that there was a study in 2019 that said the average person spends 144 minutes scrolling through social media on their phone every day. And so I invited in my social media posts, I invited people to ask themselves, what is your time worth? $25 an hour, $50 an hour, more than that? Well, let's take the $50 an hour figure, right? And if you add up the 144 minutes and times that by the $50 an hour that your times is worth, and then add that up over the course of a year, that's $43,800 that you have given to scrolling through your phone. And what would change in your marriage if you take that same amount of time and invested it in your marriage, instead of scrolling through social media. And I'd say most people actually spend more than 144 minutes scrolling, unfortunately. So we don't tend to think of our time in terms of like, what is my time worth? And because we don't do that, we aren't very intentional about our time. But what would change in your relationship if you invested that $43,800 worth of your time into your marriage?
Oh yeah, and I think we would probably both agree $50 is our time is worth a lot more than
Yes,
$50
I charge
an
a
hour.
lot more than that. So yes.
Yes, and you deserve every penny of it. And so if you take that 43,800, and I would definitely double, triple, quadruple it.
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
talking about $250,000 a year.
Yes. Yeah.
Into your relationship. And I can say, being very humble, not that I was scrolling for 144 minutes a day because social media was less present when I was married. But if I had spent that 144 minutes a day investing in my relationship, it may have turned out differently, to be honest with you. And divorce is not exactly cheap.
No, it's not.
Not just on a financial basis, but on an emotional basis. So, Debbie, what I want you, I'm hoping you can do. I've so been touched by having you as a guest. I would welcome you back as often as you would share your time, because I know people are benefiting from this. I'd love you to tell people how to get in touch with you. And what they can do to do that, and also your podcast, and I know you also have a book, so certainly promote. And then what we like to do at Owning the Goal is end every episode with an amazing guest like yourself to just sort of, if there was one thing that someone could take away, from spending an hour of their precious time with us, what that would be. But let them know first how to engage and get in touch with you.
Sure. So I have a 6-month intensive marriage recovery program. And I do it that way because I want people to understand that you didn't get to the place that you are in your marriage or your relationship overnight. And it's not going to get fixed overnight. I'm looking for people who are really serious about change, and the change that's required from within, not just the finger pointing of your spouse. And if you're ready to do that, the way to get a hold of me is through my website, debbiecaudle.com. And my book, I wrote for women, but I have had enough men read it now who are like, man, this is just as good for men as it is for women. So, don't not get it if you're a guy, because I've been given that feedback enough that I'm like, okay, I guess there's value for men. But it's called The Path Less Traveled, and it's about this crossroads moment that we come to, which is true for both sexes. We have these crossroads moments in life where we have to make a choice. We can continue down this familiar path. It's this straight shot, and we can see what's coming because we can just look back behind us and go, well, that's where I've been. And that familiar path isn't easy. It's filled with ruts from past choices, ours and other people's, hurts, disappointments, betrayals. But the one thing it's got going for it is that it's familiar. We know it. This other path, it looks like it's, free and clear of debris, but there's this bend in this path. We can't fully see around it, right? And so there's this uncertainty about what this path is like. But this new path, definitely, when we look at it, it definitely seems to hold up the promise of a better life. And what I want to convey to people what I try to convey in this book is that if you want a different life, it's up to you to do something about it. You've got to be very intentional about what you want and how to get yourself there. And there's a transitionary period where it's going to feel very difficult stepping onto that new path, because you're going to set things in motion, much like I did in my first marriage, where not every, people resist that change, right? They don't want you to be different. And so how do you step off that familiar path and onto this new path, this path of intentionality and personal responsibility that shows so much promise? So that's what the book is about. That's really what the marriage recovery program is about. And that's essentially what the High Ticket Woman podcast about is. It's for women, but as you said, there's benefit for men, because learning to raise your standard, learning to raise your expectations for yourself and for the relationships that you are in is about intentionality. So in everything that I say and everything I do, it's all about taking personal responsibility for who you are, who you want to be, and the life that you want to live.
So well said. No surprise that you're so successful with everything that you do. I would strongly encourage any gentleman who is listening to this to take this all to heart and to also dive into Debbie's podcast and her book. And if your marriage is in that state, I love the fact that you put it on a 6-month program, because it's worth it. So that's brilliant, and it's not just for a business purpose; it's for the sake of a marriage, which is absolutely brilliant. So that's absolutely incredible, and I'm so thankful to that. You definitely should be marketing to men as well.
I kind of am in a sort of,
way.
circuitous way, but yeah.
I told my life partner that I always, silly point, I always got female cats because cats are, kind of unique animals. They're
yes.
very different than dogs. Nothing against dogs, but cats, like, you have to work to get them, to figure them out. But female cats especially. So I always saw, like, female cats were a great symbolic way to understand how you
great teachers,
and
for the feline mind.
Yeah, exactly. And if you could understand a female cat, you'd have a better chance of having a successful relationship. And
there's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah,
and I am a dog person, but I recognize that internally I'm a cat because I think a lot of women are cats.
Yep.
So yes,
and that's my highest compliment. I have one female cat now, and every day I'm trying to figure out. And I'm like, the way to figure her out is not try to figure her out, because she does what she does. So
you'll have to have me back, Brian, because I have a really, really, really amazing metaphor for men and women, and I don't want to give it away, but it is one of my most recent episodes. I mean, I could talk a whole nother episode just on. It's not a dog and cat metaphor, by the way. It's a completely different metaphor, and I'm actually writing a second book around this metaphor that I'm super excited about. So,
okay, well,
have me back, and we'll talk about that.
I will. Well, as we come to a close here, I want to thank you, Debbie, so much for spending your precious time with us and with our listeners. I am really trying to bring more women into the fold here, because, to be honest, I just think you're smarter and more intelligent and more sophisticated. And no knock on men there, but it's I found that personally, so I can only speak of my own experience. Plus, there's always the asset in your relationship, gentlemen, where if you, I bet you, if you bring home Debbie's book, and your girlfriend, wife, or life partner sees you reading it, that's going to reflect well.
Brian, thank you so much for having me. I love guesting on people's podcasts. I love telling my story. I know I got long-winded there, but I love what I do, and I hope that really comes across, because it's an honor and a privilege to be invited into somebody's life and, be able to tinker around and mess around in someone's private life. I don't take that privilege lightly. So thank you for having me very much.
Oh, you're so welcome. And thank you, Debbie. Thanks to our listeners for tuning in. You can always find us at owningthegoal.com. And if you'd like to be a guest, and we will see Debbie again, I think if for as much as you'll be on here, you definitely will be a recurring guest because you're so filled with wisdom.
Thank
You
you.
can email me at brian@owningthegoal.com. We have a great YouTube channel up, Spotify, Connect, all the different platforms that you'd want to be. Check out Debbie's podcast. I'm going to scatter around. You have so many. How many episodes do you have in total at this point?
I think this week we'll hit 80.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
I know I think I'm on 12. So, as
It's
Rory
okay.
said,
Just keep plugging away.
just keep plugging away. I think you're
Yeah.
probably in the top 1% at this point. Once you get close to 100 of people who do it, because it's certainly, it's not labor, but it is love. So,
Yeah.
anyway, with that being said, Debbie, thank you so much again. And,
Yeah. Thank you.
thank you to our listeners, and we'll see you on the next episode. Should I stay or should I go?